Hey guys, Connor. You are watching the JavaScript Mastery series, and in this video we are going to be mastering all the different ways we can declare variables in JavaScript. Now then, for this video, the difficulty is going to be ranked blue belt. However, there are going to be some more slightly advanced concepts, but don't worry, I'll keep you in the loop when we get to that point. In JavaScript, there are three different ways we can declare a variable. We can either use the var, the let, or the const. Now then, the var has existed in JavaScript since the beginning of the language, whereas let and const were not introduced into JavaScript until ES6 in 2015. So that's an entire 20 years since the language was first created. Now then, to keep things simple, what we're going to do is we're going to just start by comparing the var and the let. We are going to look at the three main differences between them, and by the end of that segment you are going to understand why var is bad practice, why we don't want to use it, and why it has no place in the modern code base. Then, following up from that, we will compare the let and the const, and also look at the const in slightly more detail. The first key difference between a var and a let is vars can be redeclared with the same name. Let's take a look at that. Let's look at the code so we can see what that looks like in the code base. So var hero equals Batman. Okay, so we've just declared a variable called hero that contains the value Batman. Now then, with a var, I can declare another variable with the exact same name, no problem. And it's going to execute this using no guys, it's just executing some JavaScript, whatever. As you can see, no problem, part of the code. You know, let's give it something. It's always nice to look at something. There we go, Superman. Now then, what's the problem? What might be wrong with this? So let's imagine. Well, let's rewind a bit. So if our variables are just containers that store values, let's look at that. So we have a variable that is a container storing a value Superman, which we can access when we reference the variable name. In this case, the variable name might be named hero, and when we reference that variable name, we can access the value inside called Superman, just like we see in the code here. Now then, imagine you go into a room and there's a room full of boxes, and you see multiple boxes with the exact same label name. Well, if there's multiple boxes called hero, which one's the correct hero? Which box is the source of truth? Which one should I use? Well, it's really confusing and it's bad practice and something we want to move away from. So being able to have two variables with the exact same name that live within the same space here is really bad. And the good thing is with let, so got villain there, then I'm going to redeclare a variable with the exact same name. There we go, and straight away guys, you see we're getting an error. Cannot redeclare block scoped variable villain. It's saying you've already declared a variable with this name. You cannot redeclare another variable with the exact same name in the namespace. This is good. It's good practice. We don't want to be able to do this. It makes our code harder to read and makes it confusing for other developers reading our code. So using let enforces this good practice on us. And when I try to run this, as you can see, look, identify a villain has already been redeclared. You cannot redeclare another one, and we shouldn't want to do that. It's bad practice. If you need a second villain, let's redeclare it as appropriate. You know, we've got one villain, we've got two. So that's the first key difference. The second key difference between a var and a let is their scope. You see, a var is function scoped, whereas a let is block scoped. Now, to truly appreciate these differences, let's first understand scope a little bit more. This can be a slightly more advanced concept in JavaScript to master, However, even at the blue belt level, we still need to know it just enough to appreciate between these two types of variables. So as an example, I want you to imagine you have a house with multiple rooms, and within this house a kid gets some toys out to play with. Now whichever room the kid gets the toys out to play with is where the toys will stay. What you wouldn't want to do is get your toys out in the playroom and then see those toys spread out all the way through the house. You don't want to see those toys in the living room, the bathroom, the kitchen. The toys come out in the playroom and we want to see them stay in the playroom. This is how function scope works in JavaScript. Those variables declared in the function only stay accessible to the function only. We don't see those toys appearing in other rooms. Now then, what would be even better is when those toys come out in the playroom, what if they were put into a toy box? Now then, with function scope, even though we put those toys in the toy box, they're still going to be accessible to the entire room, okay, which isn't great. Yeah, it's nice, the house is tidy and everything looks cleaner in the house, but it would be even better if we can make the room slightly tidier. So with block scope, we can actually reduce the scope of those toys even more. We can keep the toys in the toy box with block scope, okay? So function scope represents the room, block scope represents the toy box. With block scope, we can reduce the accessibility of our variables even within a function to help keep things even more compartmentalized and tidy. So hope that explains it. Now then, let's see what this looks like in the code. Let's see what this looks like. So we might have a function and play with toys. Okay, we've got var toys, which is great. Toy, let's invoke this function. As you can see, these toys are accessible to this function, right? They were declared on line 7 and we are using them on line 9. Fantastic. Now if we was to try and use toy here, an error, toy is not defined. You see, toy is not available here, it's only available inside the function. Guys, this is great. We don't want our toy to be accessible in this entire script. We want to compartmentalize it in the room, right? This is the play area. Let's create, and maybe we only want to play with, can play with toys, true. And then we're going to put our toys inside of here. So these toys have been defined inside of this block scope here, right? You see this block? Now let's see what happens when I execute the script. As you can see, I can still use that toy that was defined in this block because this toy is still accessible to the entire function. Now then, as we used a let, this toy is only available inside this block, which is where we can play with toys. So we stop toy from spilling out of this block into the function using a let. The third key difference between a var and a let in JavaScript is their behavior when they hoist variables. Now I did let you guys know at the beginning of the video that I would give you a heads up when the difficulty creeps slightly above beginner friendly. As to understand hoisting, we have to go on the JavaScript HUD just a little bit and understand one of its quirks. Now then, I tried to come up with an analogy to explain hoisting, but none of them make sense, and that's because hoisting doesn't really make sense in JavaScript. It's super weird. So I think the best way to show you is to just demonstrate it in the code base. So let's look at that. Now let's imagine we have a variable and we're going to call, okay, let's just use the AI recommended value. Now we got a variable on line 6 with the value Batman. Now when we access this variable on line 8, as you would expect, we can see the value Batman. Now things get weird when we try to access this value before the variable was even declared. So let's see what happens when I do this. So here we're trying to use a variable before it's even been created. It shouldn't even exist at this point, right? So it wouldn't be wrong to assume that we should get an error. Instead of getting an error, actually what we're getting is undefined. So what is going on here? How can we even use this variable and not get an error? And secondly, why is it undefined? This is strange. So what's happening here, guys, is in JavaScript, your variable and function your variable declaration is being moved to the top of its scope, whereas the value is then being assigned to that variable on line 7. So here is what the code looks like now, but here's what's actually happening under the hood. So let's just move this here so that we can use this top line as a representation as the top of our scope. So here's what it actually looks in JavaScript. You see this declaration is being moved up here, and then the value is then being assigned to that variable on line 5. And this is why we are getting undefined on line 3. With variables in JavaScript, if we don't assign a value on them when they are initialized, the default value that they get is undefined. So here what's really happening is var's being created with hero. It's being given the value undefined. And then on line 3, we are seeing undefined because JavaScript has indeed assigned the value undefined at the top of the scope. And then the value is being assigned to it where we initially assigned it, right, on line 5. And that is why on line 7 we actually see Batman, because at this point the value has actually been assigned. And look guys, this is what you're seeing, because this is what is happening after our code has been compiled. Now looking at this, that doesn't look weird, but when we declare our code like this and we're able to access that value before it was initialized, it's really confusing. It's super quirky. There's no use case we really want to be doing this in JavaScript. It's bad practice, and it just makes our code harder to read if we're able to use it on line 3 when it wasn't actually initialized and assigned a value until line 5. So this is another issue with var that the let addresses. Now when I use let hero, assign the value Batman, again we're going to try and use that variable before it was declared and assigned a value. Let's see what happens. And as you can see guys, we're getting an error. It's saying you cannot access hero before initialization. So with let, we get prevented from using this variable until it's actually been initialized, which is what we want. This is a lot easier to read, and we should indeed get an error before we've attempted to use it. So why does this, what's the reason for this? Like why is this now resolved? So let is also hoisted to the top of the scope just like var, but the difference between the let and the var is the let gets held in a temporary dead zone where we get prevented from accessing this variable until it's actually been initialized where we thought it was here. So technically this may look like this, and then it's going to get assigned that value here. But what JavaScript does is it holds this value in a temporary dead zone and doesn't allow us to access it until it was actually created, preventing us from being able to use this variable until it's actually initialized and used as it should expect, and gets rid of that quirk. The fourth key difference between a var and a let. In the browser, when we declare a var outside of a function, that variable actually becomes a part of the global window object, whereas a let does not. So it's good to get this one down because not many people know this one, and it could really impress in a job interview. So let's just generate some basic HTML template. Var and one declared with a let. I'm a var variable. I am a let variable. As we can see, they're both declared outside of a function, right? Now if I just spin this up, so I am a var variable, I am a let variable. Now if I go in here and I type in window, as we can see, I've got this global variable, I am a var variable, but the let one isn't there. We obviously want to avoid this, right? Last thing we want to do is pollute that window object unnecessarily. So this is another reason why we don't use var and we should use the let. All of the issues that let addresses with the var are also addressed with the const. So we never want to use var. We're always wanting to use one of these two keywords to declare our variables in a modern code base. Now then, we understand what the let is, but what is the const? The const is a constant value that once assigned, we never want to be able to change. So let's see what that looks like. Now I may have a hero, and at a later time I might want to change the hero of the story to Superman, and great, we can use that with a let. See, no errors, and when we see const.log Superman, great. Now if he was to change his let to a const, as you can see guys, we get an assignment error, assignment to constant variable. So with a const, we restrict the ability to be able to redeclare another value to this variable at a later point in our code base. Now then, when might you want to be able to do this? So maybe you have an API endpoint that's making a request to an API, and this API is never going to change. There's no reason we would want it to change. It's going to be baked into our configuration, and if someone was to change it, it could cause an error in our code base by going to an API that doesn't exist. Another example, maybe you've got a mathematical calculation of pi. I don't actually know if that's the correct value. I'm trusting the AI model that Cursor is using, but pi is never going to change, right? So don't allow it to change, because that could cause a bug in our code base. Instead, we would want to use a constant. So guys, just to recap, var is bad. We don't want to use it, and the only reason why it exists in JavaScript today is for backwards compatibility. You see, JavaScript just wants to make sure that all of those old websites and applications that use var can still work today. So it remains in the language, so it doesn't cause any break-in changes for those old applications. 2, hopefully by now you understand the difference between the let and the const. If we have a value that we never want to change, then we want to use the const. If that value is going to change, or we think it might, then we want to use the let. Also, we did cover some slightly more advanced concepts. We dug into scope, and we looked at hoisting. Now, if those concepts were a little bit too tricky, don't be overwhelmed. Like I said, they're not very beginner friendly. So if you did struggle on those, then just note them down for now. And then in the future, after you've been coding a bit more and you have a bit more experience, come back to them and see if those concepts are a little easier. You're not going to master JavaScript just because you watched a couple of videos. You're going to need to actually put in the work, solving real problems and building applications. So once you've got your hands a bit more dirty in JavaScript, come back, see if it's any easier. Well, and yeah, that's it. That's a wrap, guys.